Welcome to Arfo Tech. In this video, we'll help you take your first steps in Python. If you're new to programming or just want to learn a new language, you're in the right place. Python is a popular and easy-to-learn programming language, so it's an excellent choice to get started. Let's start with the basics. In any introduction to a new programming language, you can't miss the famous Hello World. This is the first program you start with, and it consists of programming an application that displays the text Hello World on the screen. If you execute the following code, you will have accomplished the first milestone of Python programming. What did we just do? What is this print function? The print function is a built-in Python function used to print values to the console or screen. In this case, we gave it the value Hello World as an argument, which caused it to print to the screen. Unlike other programming languages, in Python, this can be done in a single line. Okay, now let's explain more simply how to define variables in Python. A variable is a space in the computer memory that we use to store a value. In Python, to define a variable we simply give it a name and assign it a value. For example, we can create a variable called age and assign it the value 25 as follows. Python is very smart, and when it sees the number 25, it knows that it is an integer. Therefore, we do not need to specify that age is an integer variable. If we wanted to assign it a decimal value, for example 3.14, Python would recognize that it is a floating point number. Once we have defined a variable, we can use it anywhere in the program. For example, we can print its value on the screen with the print function, as we saw earlier. The output on the screen would be 25. In the code shown above, you can also see a hashtag followed by the number 25. This is called a comment and does not affect the result of the program. It is simply a way of writing notes within the code so that other programmers or even yourself in the future can better understand what the program does. In this case, the comment indicates that the age result is 25, but it is not necessary to write it for the program to work. It is important to note that variable names in Python must follow some rules. For example, they must begin with a letter or an underscore, and they cannot have white space. In addition, it is good practice to use descriptive variable names that indicate their function or content. For example, instead of using x we could use user_age if we want to store the age of a user. Now, let's talk about how to add two variables in Python. The first thing we do is to declare the variables, which means to create them and give them a name. In this case, we use the name a for a variable with value 3 and the name b for another variable with value 7. After declaring the variables, we can use the operator to add them together and store the result in a third variable or simply display the result directly on the screen using the print function. In this case, we choose to display the result directly on the screen with the sum of a and b, so the output would be 10. It is important to note that we can only use variables that have been previously defined. If we try to use a variable such as c that has not been previously declared, Python will throw an error indicating that the variable does not exist. Also note that variable names are case sensitive, which means that variable a and variable a are different. Therefore, it is important to make sure that you use the same variable name in all instances where you want to refer to it. Let's move on to another important concept in programming: conditional statements. A conditional statement is a block of code that executes only if a specified condition is true. In Python, the most common conditional statement is the if statement. The basic syntax of an if statement is as follows: if condition, code to execute if condition is true. The code inside the if statement is executed only if the condition is true. If the condition is false, the code inside the if statement is skipped. Let's see an example. In this example, we first define a variable age and give it a value of 18. Then, we use an if statement to check if age is greater than or equal to 18. If the condition is true, the code inside the if statement is executed, which in this case is to print the message "you are an adult" to the screen. If the condition had been false, the code inside the if statement would have been skipped. It's important to note that the code inside the if statement is indented. In Python, the level of indentation is used to indicate which lines of code belong to a particular block of code. In this case, the indented code belongs to the if statement. In addition to the if statement, Python also has an else statement that can be used to execute code when the condition in the if statement is false. The syntax of an if-else statement is as follows: if condition, code to execute if condition is true, else, code to execute if condition is false. Let's see an example. This code is practically the same as the previous one, except that if the condition is false, the code inside the else statement is executed, which is to print, "You are a minor" on the screen. Finally, in this video fragment, we are going to see how Python allows you to store decimal values and text strings in variables. First, to store a decimal value, you must indicate the number using the dot as decimal separator. For example, if you want to store the value 18.321 in a variable, you can do it as follows. On the other hand, if you want to store a text string in a variable, it is necessary to indicate its content between single or double quotation marks. For example, if you want to store the string hello world in a variable, you can do it in the following way. It is important to note that in Python, single and double quotes are used interchangeably to indicate text strings. However, it is advisable to maintain a consistent style throughout the code. We hope that you found today's content informative and useful. With this introduction, you should now be ready to move on to the next tutorial where we will dive deeper into Python syntax. Remember to practice and experiment with the concepts you have learned today to enhance your understanding of Python.